Welcome everyone to the second workshop for the California Adaptation Forum's track number 1, focused on advancing equitable adaptation. My name is Julia Kim. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the Local Government Commission, who's hosting the California Adaptation Forum series in partnership with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And I'm calling in from the traditional and unceded lands of the Ohlone people up here in the Bay Area. I'd also like to welcome Monica and Faye, and along with both of them, Nick also serves as the facilitators for this track, as well as getting some support from our friends at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And we have Nikki on the line with us as well. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce our support team. We have John and Kelsey here with us who are providing support, so feel free to chat any one of us throughout today's workshop if you have any questions or if you're encountering any technical issues. And do feel free to introduce yourself via the if you can share your name. Right, let me
I just have more unrelated questions.
Sorry about that. If you can keep yourselves muted to avoid any background noise, that would be great. We'll be here in the back end trying to manage that as well. Yes, if you haven't already, we'd love for you to introduce yourself through the chat function. Your name, your pronoun, your organization, your location, and a land acknowledgement would be great. So for folks who joined us on our first workshop, which we held a few weeks ago, it was focused on dismantling white supremacy. We heard a presentation from Ariel Guerrero with ONG Racial Equity Collaborative, and had some discussions around how white supremacy shows up in the workplace and then also in our work as adaptation practitioners. Everyone should have received the recording and notes from our main session, as well as the Jamboards that capture the notes from our breakout discussions. We do have another set of breakouts this afternoon, or not this afternoon, later on in this agenda. So I wanted to briefly go over our group norms just to ground ourselves again in those group norms. So let me go ahead and share my screen here, and I'll share the link to this over chat in just a moment. We do have the overall CAF Code of Conduct. And again, this is really focused on having everyone gathered here behaving in a courteous and respectful manner. We do have a few more specific group norms that we adopted for this track, and we shared this out as part of the follow-up from our first workshop and invited folks to share some suggestions for improvement, additional group norms. We didn't actually get anything, so this is going to be the final set of group norms that we'll be asking everyone to follow as part of this series. So again, we'll share this over chat, so I won't walk through this in great detail, but asking folks to stay engaged, practicing compassionate listening, taking space and making space, just being aware of any privileges that your identities may hold, and creating space for others to step in, being courageous and expecting and accepting a lack of closure. Since we are convening over Zoom, I know many of you are very familiar with Zoom. Since we do have quite a few folks gathered, we're asking folks to use the hand raising feature to be unmuted, and keeping yourselves muted if just to prevent any additional background noise from coming in. Since there are a lot of folks, just using the chat function to voice agreement, to share your reflections throughout today's workshops, any relevant resources, feel free to use that space to connect with the full audience and to also connect with folks one-on-one. Everyone should have the ability to do that. Feel free to turn your camera on for the full duration of the workshop, but we do ask folks, if you're willing to turn your video on during the breakout discussions, if you're able to, that would be great. Limiting distractions, but then at the same time, taking breaks and taking care of yourself throughout this workshop. We do have a scheduled break, but it is a 2-hour workshop, bright and early Monday morning. So whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, we encourage you to do that. And with that, I will pass it over to Faye to kind of ground us in today's workshop, the objectives and agenda.
All right. Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everybody. My name is Faye. My pronouns are they and them. Yeah, we will have 2 great panelists here today to start off. I'll introduce them really briefly. And we'll have a generous amount of time to do Q&A. And then after that session, we'll go into a break. And then Monica will introduce our breakout room discussions for a chance for all of us as peers to talk to one another, and then do breakout or report backs from those breakouts. So the objective of this particular workshop is really to think about how we move from our principles to practice. And we talked on the first session about white supremacy in the workplace and just kind of the foundations for understanding how those racial inequities play out as professionals, and then also like how that influences us when we're looking at climate adaptation work. So this particular session, we want to be thinking about how we move away, or how we move from the kind of the plans and the frameworks and so on to actually actualize and implementing some of those things. So we have two great panelists. First is Leah Benberger, who is the Director of Sustainability at the City of Providence in Rhode Island. Leah was appointed the director in April of 2015. Leah brings a wealth of experience in municipal sustainability efforts. She previously managed the City of Boston's citywide sustainability initiative, Renovate Boston. In that role, she worked on policy and community engagement and led the development of the city's 2014 Climate Action Plan. Under her current mayor, Leah has prioritized centered racial equity in this work, demonstrated by the launch of the Equity and Sustainability Initiative 2016 and the release of the Climate Justice Plan in 2019. So very excited to hear about all that work in Providence. We're also joined by Jessica Boydea, the acting executive director of the Strategic Growth Council here in California. Jessie has more than 15 years of experience in the foundation, government, and nonprofit sectors, advancing progressive public policy and social impact programs, and currently is the acting executive director for the California Strategic Growth Council. Strategic Growth Council promotes sustainability, health, and equity across the state by helping California achieve its climate goals through place-based and community planning. And prior to that, Jessie was the Community Benefits and Social Responsibility Manager at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, where she was responsible for implementing the agency's landmark community benefits and environmental justice programs across its water, power, and sewer enterprises, as well as participating in the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So with that, I'll pass it over to Leah to do the first presentation.
Great, thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to pull up my slides. Give me 1 second. So, as per my introduction, my name is Leah Benberger. I'm the Director of Sustainability with the City of Providence in Rhode Island. And just as some context, Rhode Island, Providence is the capital city of Rhode Island, a very, very small state, a lot of coastline, certainly aware and working to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Very, very important to our city here, which is protected. This picture in the upper left is our hurricane barrier, which protects us from severe, or at least part of the city downtown, from storm surges, sea level rise, and heat, all impacts that we're acutely concerned of here in Providence. And so, of course, I want to start by acknowledging the indigenous tribes that still are very, very present here in Rhode Island, the Narragansett, the Nipmuc in particular here in Rhode Island, and largely a culture and way of life that has been extremely changed and modified by colonization. So our history here in Providence is very much tied to the Industrial Revolution, which of course is really one of the root causes of climate change that we're trying to address. So Providence was developed and industrialized in the late 17th century. Moses Brown and Samuel Slater opened the first water-powered cotton spinning factory in the U.S. in Pawtucket, which is the town just to the north of Providence. And this created a vast transformation of our landscape, of our economic system, and of our social system here in Rhode Island and in New England and really across the globe. And I also want to just make a direct connection, the mills here in the Northeast and the wealth that was generated from those mills was based on cotton that was extracted by slave labor from the South. That's just one way of many that we are this issue is intrinsically connected to the history of slavery in this country. And in so many ways and on so many levels, we are still grappling with that history. Just one example of an old industrial building along the river here in Providence. We have brownfields, we have pollution, we have industrial sites today that continue to pollute and cause air quality issues. We have some of the highest asthma rates in the country and the state. They're highest in Providence. Even when you control for income, we're still seeing disproportionately higher rates in sort of our frontline communities along the waterfront, the port area. Another legacy of the industrialization is lead, which exists in our soils across the city, and we have some extraordinarily high lead poisoning rates in kindergarten students here in Providence. These numbers are old, they've improved, but they're still not great. They're still way too high, and you can see here in some neighborhoods, upwards of 30% of kindergarten age students are suffering from lead poisoning. So I started with the City of Providence in 2015, and in that kind of first year, took time to really, I came from Massachusetts, not that far, I was very familiar with Providence, but not as someone who lived and worked there as I do now. So getting to know the community, getting to know the work that had been done already. We had a sustainability plan, but there was definitely a disconnect from a lot of the issues I was hearing and seeing in the city and what was in that plan. The plan was created without a significant budget, so there wasn't a robust engagement process. It was a lot of the usual suspects. And so we started work to try to address that. We received some funding to start to think about what would that plan look like, what would our work look like if we were to really center equity in our work, and what does centering equity in our work even look like? So to start that, we helped create the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee, which is a group of frontline community members in the city, and they were paid to work with us and still are working with us to help us bring an equity analysis and lens to our work. So this work started in about 2016 when it started, and they came up with a framework called the Racial, Equitable, and Just Providence Framework, which this is a snapshot of it. There's a lot more to it, but these are principles and values that we strive to uphold in order to center racial equity in our work. Also, a really important part of this first step was some initial acknowledgments about harms that have been caused by government to BIPOC communities in Providence. And we also did racial equity training with community members and government officials together to really, which was an important sort of, I guess, trust building component of the work, and to really demonstrate to community members that we're serious about this work and it's not simply lip service. So I think what was really important in this first step was building those relationships, those partnerships partnerships with frontline community members and supporting them so they could lead on this work and tell government what we should be doing to address these issues and acknowledging the past harms that have happened. Another important component of the sort of early years of our work was this spectrum of engagement, community engagement to ownership. We had an evaluation done to understand where we were on the spectrum. So it's very similar to the spectrum of community engagement, but it goes into a lot more depth and detail about how to transfer power and how to move along this spectrum. So you might start in a place of placation or ignore on the far left. And the goal is to move towards delegating power and shifting towards community ownership. And this has been a very useful framework for us as we continue on this work to understand where we are in the spectrum, what we need to do to move to the next stage, and just that understanding that this work requires a lot of scaffolding. You can't just jump to community ownership. There's a lot of capacity building that has to happen within government and within community to move along, to make progress as you build those relationships, and hopefully, get to a place where you're really able to make decisions in collaboration, and delegating power and shifting towards community ownership. One of the principles that we follow that emerged from this work is targeted universalism. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, but I like to explain it using the story of the vegetable peeler. The metal one on the right was sort of the classic original vegetable peeler that had been used for, I don't know, decades, hundreds of years, who knows. But at one point, a designer had an issue because I believe it was his mother, had arthritis and was really struggling to grip that vegetable peeler. So he went through a bunch of iterations to design a vegetable peeler that she could use given her arthritis. And that's where this sort of newer design on the left emerged. And the takeaway here is that you design for folks with the greatest needs who are, whether it's the most marginalized or whatever the sort of hindrance in society is, you'll come up with solutions that work well for everybody. And another way to explain is thinking about this curve, right? We usually design policies and programs for the bulk of the people in the middle. On the one hand, you have sort of the 1%ers who aren't going to use or don't need those services. On the other hand, you have the really hard to reach populations. But we continue to design programs and policies for the folks here in the middle, the masses. And we essentially neglect to ever meet the needs of the folks over here. So targeted universalism, shifting to this other graphic with the concentric, or the circles, the embedded circles, starting on the outside, designing for folks at the margins who are, as I said, have been most marginalized, most disadvantaged throughout society, and then working your way in to design programs, solutions, policies that will work for everybody. So we applied that work and continued with the Racial Environmental Justice Committee to develop a climate action plan that was released in the fall of 2019. We started this work in 2017. It was a very long process. Again, we structured the process so that we continue to center those who are most impacted. And that meant, as an example, we never had a big public meeting that said, hey, community, Providence, come to this public meeting, share your thoughts, tell us what you think should be in our climate plan. We did very targeted process and targeted engagement to make sure that those who were most impacted, had the most at stake, were centered in the process. So that started with a formal agreement and partnership with the Racial Environmental Justice Committee. They helped design the entire engagement process, and we worked very closely with them every step of the way. But to get started, we knew that we needed more folks who, and even some of the REJC members, to have a better understanding of our energy system and sort of the nuances of how our energy system works and where it comes from and how it gets to us and the policies around that. And so we did, the REJC, actually a few of the members led a training program where they learned about energy democracy, learned about environmental justice and organizing. And from there, the folks who participated in that went out into back in their community and asked 4 very simple questions to guide what were the priorities and concerns that the plan was to address. We asked, how do you keep warm in the winter? What do you like about that? What would you change? How do you keep cool in the summer? What do you like about that? What would you change? How to get around the city? What do you like about that? What would you change? And is there anything in your community that's making you sick? So with that process, we came up with a long list of priorities and concerns from frontline communities, and we designed solutions based on those. And we went back and forth with we also had a technical partner, the Acadia Center, a nonprofit, who did an analysis to how do we actually get to our carbon neutral goal, what policies and programs are needed. And we essentially married that list, modified, added to and adjusted that list so that those policies, those solutions, that grouping of solutions would not only get us to our carbon neutral goal by 2050, but it would also address the priorities and concerns of frontline communities. So some of the things that we heard from those questions were issues that might not rise to a traditional kind of climate action planning process. Issues about broken radiators or just heating systems not working, getting your utilities shut off, not having enough places in the neighborhood to be out in nature, gentrification. This quote here in the middle says, every time our community gets cleaned up, white folks want it and start moving us out. We need to make sure we won't get kicked out before we push to make good things happen. And then certainly the Port of Providence came up a lot in the pollution and industries that are impacting communities in that neighborhood. So with that sort of list of solutions, we had a great set of policies, but we had to go back to the community members that were engaged in this process and sort of share what we had come up with based on what they shared. We were struggling to do that because it was a somewhat kind of wonky list of solutions. And that's where we came up with these future stories that are told from the perspective of residents in the future of Providence in 2040, 2050. And they're sharing stories about their neighborhoods based on how, as if the entire climate justice plan has been implemented. So they're very relatable, and they're available in English and Spanish. And I encourage you to take a look at or listen to those, actually, their audio clips if you have a chance. So moving forward, as I mentioned, that plan was released in 2019. One of the really important parts of that collaborative governance spectrum, the engagement to ownership spectrum, is to continue moving into implementation in partnership. So it's certainly not, okay, great, we have a planning process, now the city's going to go and implement. We're continuing to work collaboratively with our community partners to follow a similar sort of power sharing and decision-making process to make sure that as we implement the plan, we're continuing to share power with community members, ensure they are decision makers in the process for developing these programs and implementing the plan. And I'm not going to go into too much detail of what exactly we're working on. There's a brief list here. But I think really the important thing is not what we're doing, but how we're doing it. And the fact that we are really striving every step of the way to center those who are most impacted in the decision-making process and build capacity both within government and community to be implementing and developing and designing this work together. I don't know if you want to take questions at the end or now, but I'll wrap it there. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Leah. Yeah, if folks have questions, please put them into the chat. I think we'll try and do them all together as a Q&A. And I think we can move to Jesse's presentation. Jesse, whenever you're ready. Oh, you seem to be muted.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just gonna take 1 second to load up my presentation. Great. Does this look okay for everybody? Nice. All right. Thank you. And so Jessie Boydea, Acting Executive Director at the California Strategic Growth Council. Thank you so much for inviting me today to present to you. I am just going to say I'm not monitoring the chats because I'll be going through, I can't see it on my screen, but if you do have a question, feel free to interrupt me. And then obviously also we'll facilitate a Q&A at the end. So again, huge shout out to Rhode Island. That was an incredibly impressive presentation, and you guys are my new crush for the week. I just want you to know that. The approach to the story I'm going to tell is a little bit different in that we are going to really be focusing on organizationally the development of our racial equity action plan, which then is a plan that helps guide all of our programs, policies, and operations. And then I'll go deep on giving you guys examples of how we've been able to implement it. But for those of you who are new to SGC, all right, I'm just gonna have to do it this way. Sorry, guys. Our vision is to have healthy, thriving, and resilient communities for all. And we're really focused as a council on coordinating and working collaboratively with public agencies, communities, and stakeholders to achieve sustainability, equity, economic prosperity, and quality of life for all Californians. What sets us apart is that our council is made up of 6 cabinet secretaries and 3 public members that represent, for California, the agencies that oversee our planning and research work, our environmental protection work, our transportation work, our housing and community development work, our health and human services work, and our natural resources. And we are convened legislatively to really be focused on building sustainable and equitable communities in California. Last summer, which many of you guys experienced it also, there was a significant call to action at our council to try to figure out what exactly we were going to do as a state to really fulfill our promise of a California for all. And what that looked like with, again, the support of Governor Newsom is us doubling down on our efforts to build capacity across the state of California to do racial equity work, regardless of where you are, whether you're in natural resources, whether you are in business consumer services, whether you are in IT, that everyone had an obligation to do racial equity. So SGC partnered with the Public Health Institute and a number of different foundations to launch the Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity, which is really focused on embedding racial equity approaches into institutional culture, policies, and practices. I'll just go through this quickly, but we, over the last few years, have developed and trained a number of different state departments and agencies, as you'll see here, with the goal of developing these racial equity action plans, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So can you just, like, with your hands raise if you are part of a government or effort that has actually developed publicly facing racial equity action plans? Could you, like, I know some of you guys are off. Okay, wait, there's other folks. Okay, and there's probably some hands coming up. A lot of people, it's like, oh, people feel very excited to launch into racial equity action plan, but they're like, what do we need to actually be successful? And how do we create plans that don't just, like, sit on a shelf? And so I'm about to tell you what our journey looked like at SGC. Our council leadership plays a really big role in being able to direct everything that we do within our organization. So it's really important to get council member and leadership buy-in at the front end. We asked them to unanimously approve a we asked them to approve a racial equity action plan and vision statement, which they unanimously approved. And that helped launch our racial equity action work into the future. And so this was something that we developed through participating in the Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity, and it required some iterations. And so when the time comes, I'm happy to answer about like those questions of like, when are you ready to make something public? And we feel passionate that it is the great is the enemy of the good, and you should just get something out there publicly as soon as you can. Because being able to actually have it launched in the public forum indicated to the public, our grantees, our stakeholders, that this was a priority for the council and for this new administration. Not only did we actually get them to approve this racial equity action plan, but we went on to have the racial equity action plan be a standing item on our agenda for the council. And we designated the council as a place to be able to lift up and share best practices that were going on across the state of California. And eventually passed the racial equity resolution, which actually engaged not only our own programs, policies, and operations at SGC, but those of our council members also, and invited them back to this public forum for transparency's sake to be able to report out on their developments. Our racial equity action plan at SGC is really completely aligned with our vision statement. So it is about all people in California living in healthy, thriving, and resilient communities, regardless of race. And that we advance that through incorporating racial equity into all the aspects of our organizational operations. And so that's council leadership and staff training, promoting fair access and hiring, greater opportunity in contracting, and targeted outreach and engagement, distributing funding and resources in a way that is dismantling racial equity, providing technical assistance and capacity building opportunities to level the playing field, and then leveraging our role as an interagency convener. A few highlights from that effort that I want to share with you around implementation included workforce equity. So for us as an organization, there's only 30 people within our organization. It was important to invest resources to actually dig deep and begin establishing a goal for our workforce equity efforts, to collect data for benchmarking, which we hadn't been doing before, incorporating workforce equity best practices, which we'll share in a little bit, analyzing and reporting on the outcomes, incorporating lessons learned, and then sharing the best practices within this public forum. Each year we come to our council sharing this kind of benchmark database, which compares SGC. Our goal is to reflect the diversity in the state of California. So we benchmark our own staffing demographics to that within civil service and also the California population as a whole. And that helps us figure out what new innovative sort of outreach efforts we can engage in. We are a Prop 209 state, so we can't explicitly hire based on race, but we can actually use networks and outreach mechanisms to be able to ensure that we have a diverse set of high quality candidates in our pools for every one of our job postings that go out. We also partner very closely with over 50 community-based organizations who help us reach out to their own networks related to job opportunities that come down our pike. Another example that we have around implementation is for program development and design. And what this looks like for us is we make sure to analyze our award data at the front end. We identify any gaps that we see. We develop holistic strategies to be able to find solutions to those gaps. And we analyze and report on the outcomes, and we incorporate lessons learned. This is our life cycle. What this looks like for us is last year when we analyzed our grant programs, we realized that we actually had not been serving tribal governments effectively in order to honor the California for All vision. And so each of our programs figured out last year how they were going to specifically focus on being able to address that significant gap. What that looked like is one of our programs did a tribal set aside within their grants. We also invested more heavily in tribal engagement for another one of our programs. We partnered with another agency to administer federal funding to the tribe through a tribal government challenge planning grants. And we also did technical assistance with a significant set aside for tribal technical assistance guidance. And so this was an important leadership decision because it meant we identified a gap and then we were going to dedicate the appropriate resources to be able to find solutions to that gap. And I should say, you know, what came out of this is that we actually, this strategy worked and we were able to partner with a number of new tribal grantees and also capacity building partnerships. In the space of technical assistance and capacity building, our theory of change here was really about having an intentional focus on equity, a commitment to engaging diverse voices, hiring staff and consultants with racial equity competencies, which we wrote into the language, and also the deployment of racial equity strategies, which to us meant listening tours, capacity building, technical assistance, and interagency coordination. What helped us in this effort is that we were able to build out 2 new equity-focused program teams at SGC. And these positions were the first at SGC that really specifically called out equity in regards to a significant portion of their portfolio and their work. And some of it is related to our technical assistance and capacity building. Some of it is related to our interagency coordination. And so staffing up was very important. And then lastly, around interagency coordination, we developed a racial equity working group, which helped administer our racial equity resolution, which spoke to the spirit, again, of the Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity, which was, how do you infuse racial equity into everything that you do, from agency operations, programs, policies, and practices, to implementing concrete measurable actions that people could actually see and feel and hear that you could report back out on, working with state departments to align the racial equity efforts, and then to use this public forum to gather feedback from the public. And so we have spent the last year standing up that group with the goal of being able to have a race to the top, meaning that instead of having all these agencies feel like they're doing this on their own, that we're in real time sharing best practices, milestones, connections, so that we can help every agency in the state of California be able to have a racial equity action plan. And so that's the story I wanted to come and share with you guys about the implementation part of developing a racial equity action plan, but I'm happy to answer any additional questions that you may have. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for your presentation. A lot of great details there as well from the state level. So now we'll open it up to the Q&A session with Leah and Jesse. I know there were already a couple of questions that got put into the chat, so feel free to, as you think of them, actually in the chat, I'll keep an eye on that as we go through a couple that we thought of beforehand. So maybe to kick it off first for both of you, it sounded like there was already some initial support within your organizations and also externally, but would love to hear like how you continue to build that support within your organizations and get buy-in from folks that were maybe like on the fence or maybe actively less supportive of it, both as a decision maker or as staff, to really advance your racial equity work. So whoever would like to go first on that question.
Happy to start. So, you know, we started this work before, I mean, certainly before the murder of George Floyd, and when a lot of governments are starting to be a lot more proactive on racial equity, and even before that, and this work started in, so it was we started, I think, even before President Trump was elected, or it was right around that same time. So we didn't, there wasn't a lot of people in government talking about racial equity in the way that they are now. And fortunately, we have a mayor who is very supportive, and also, at least at the time, pretty hands-off on these issues. Wasn't something that I think, especially on the racial equity side, something that he cares deeply about, and has in recent years been a lot more active on. But at the time, wasn't one of the top priorities or issues that the city was working on, and neither was climate. And it was really a blessing because it gave us the time to do this work with community members, and to really let the community lead and have it not be a top-down, politically driven effort. And we've seen recent efforts that are more top-down and are more politically led, at least, and it creates a lot of challenges that we didn't have to manage. In terms of engaging, other departments, it's a challenge, and it's an ongoing effort for sure. We've tried equity brown bag lunches when we first got started. The RJC initially had 5 seats for government folks who are kind of our core partners in this work. A few different departments that we work closely with. But that we backpedaled from because it was really having that many folks from the government, from the city at these meetings turned out not to be very productive. So I think, you gotta just find the strategies that work and be persistent. There were certainly times when I felt like I was kind of losing political chips internally because I kept pressing on these issues. And at various times I had to kind of step back, but and take, find other people in the organization to really be driving that message. But I think what's worked best for us is really focusing on those community partnerships and building the power in the community, because then it's not just on me to be getting these other departments to be doing this work with me. They're really getting pushed from the community and from the administration, the leadership too. So I think what's most important is having the grassroots support in the community, as well as the political and elected leaders. And with those things, I think you can do a lot to drive change in the middle.
Yes, I mean, similar to Leah, I feel like it was hard to get racial equity on the radar in a state that has Prop 209, and where people were very nervous about being able to even say the R word. And I think that the partnership we had with philanthropy to essentially normalize and create a permissive environment to be able to talk about these issues was a very significant step in, again, creating the space for program and policy folks to be able then to design things with racial equity as a focus. And so I think for me, one of the most important pieces is around how you normalize the conversation at the highest levels and how you create transparent processes that people could actually see and measure and hold agencies accountable to. And so I've actually included our racial equity action plan as a link, and also the resolution, which is helping create some oversight role for then our interagency partners, because you'll find that some people are just naturally more passionate about it than other people. That happens within organizations and within agencies. And so there was a question related to how do you get existing employees on board. I actually think it just has to be set from the top, because what I found in my experience doing this work is that there's a lot of passion with new employees, and people sort of who have less like formal power. And then there might be like the elected officials at the very top, or the public figures, right, who can be held accountable by stakeholders. But some of your biggest challenges are like middle management that are like, we just need to like move projects, and we need them on timelines, and we need them within budget, and everything else that you're doing seems like additive, and not as important. And so to be able to have a top-down structure, yes, is really important. And there are actually like identifying middle management champions has been a really important part of it, because they can speak to each other, about the importance of this work.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it sounds like, like depending on what kind of organization you're at, like, there might be different strategies that work better for different contexts. So yeah, great to hear a couple of different perspectives there. Let's see, questions in the chat. There was a question from Daniel about how mainstream green organizations are incorporating these equity principles when budgets are tightened or priorities are sidelined. So maybe for the two of you with your partners, if you've seen any kind of shifts, when things were economically less stable for them, like how you were able to kind of push forward with that, and speak to a little bit of that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if this exactly answers the question or addresses the question. But when we first started this work, we actually, especially when it came to the climate justice plan, we got a lot of pushback from the mainstream green organizations because they wanted to be at the table. And they felt entitled to be there, and couldn't understand how we were going about creating a climate plan without creating space for them. And, my responsibility throughout the process was to keep those sorts of stakeholders and other stakeholders informed. So thinking back to that spectrum, they were on the informed stage. They were not centered in the decision making, but I was sharing information, keeping them updated. And one of the things that was really key to getting past some of that pushback was when we started the process and we did the anti-racism training, we included a lot of the mainstream environmental organizers who we work closely with. And oftentimes it was just individuals who are interested in participating in their own time. But when I would get pushback, there was an example of one meeting where the work was being challenged, and there were other folks in the room who were able to sort of validate our process and support it and speak up in its defense, because they had that racial equity analysis and they understood why it was so important for folks to be stepping back. So that was really helpful to managing that process. And now I would say, I think a lot of these organizations are now going through their own racial equity reforms, or whatever you want to call it, and really doing the work internally as well. So it's fortunately it is contagious. In this case, a good thing.
Great. Jessie, do you have anything to add on that question?
No, not specifically on that question, but I just wanted to add that to somebody's earlier questions about anti-displacement measures, and I have a few TCC alum here, some Monica Palmera, amongst other people. We have a program called the Transformative Climate Communities Program that also has a $400,000 UCLA evaluation study aligned with it to actually start beginning to answer those questions about what are the anti-displacement measurements that actually work, what are the community engagement measurements that actually work, what are the workforce development measurements that actually work in climate investments plans. And so I just wanted to share with you those two links for the individual who brought up anti-displacement.
I can also just add to that question. I don't think I have an answer of a specific policy or solution, but I do think that the process, again, is really important to focus on in that piece, because if you're truly engaging community members and are allowing them to be the decision maker, they're not going to support policies or programs or a collection of policies and programs that are going to result in their own displacement. So making sure they're at the table and you're not sticking in a silo. So you have to be thinking about housing. You got to be thinking about these cross connections to make sure you're thinking about the system holistically to avoid some of those consequences.
Great, thank you both for sharing that. So Jessica, you mentioned a little bit earlier about kind of a couple of accountability practices. So we'd love to hear a little bit from both of you, like how your organizations have really been able to keep on track and like keep accountable to the plans and programs that you've set out. If you've done any kind of like really specific like tracking of progress, and yeah, like if those have been successful for you as a mechanism.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. We actually have a public meeting. So if your government agency has a public forum, I think that that's pretty critical and important for just transparency issues. We have a commitment to go back once a year to report out on the outcomes of the progress of our racial equity action plan, as well as utilizing that forum to then lift up best practices that are happening within the organization, but also across the state. And so that has been, for us, it's been a unique space because there's not an office of racial equity at the state level. There's legislation to try to create it, but it's not in place right now. So right now, it really is agencies that are deciding to take this on for themselves because they think it's important, or, as I like to think, have been peer pressured into it by people like us at SGC. And so for them, we have found that making it be a forum that's really about lifting up best practices, things that are working, has been helpful, because I think most agencies have a tendency to just not want to be called out in public for things that are going wrong. And so I feel like by focusing on the data and being very clear about what the data is, but about what solutions you have moving forward and whether they're being effective or not effective, it depersonalizes it a little bit, which I think is incredibly important for this kind of work. The other thing too is, there is this and I will say in an area that doesn't have, like, it's not regulated, but a race to the top in trying to be the most progressive and most forward thinking around these issues. And because SGC, we don't have the levers that like a regulatory agency would have, to ensure that things are actually happening. We really use our stakeholders, in an inside outside way to either, effectively call out when things are not going well, but also to just promote and say, when are things actually going well? And we feel like it's, having been an advocate for a long time, I have forgotten that there's also value in having a carrot, and being able to say, like, remember when you do the report cards, like, you can't give everyone an F, like, can you try, like, who are the people that are actually really going out of their way to be doing good work in partnership with stakeholder on the spectrum, as you guys were saying, that was closer to the empowerment side. How do we lift up that model, and how do we make it easy for other agencies who are a little further away from that structure to incorporate those best practices in what they do? And so we've been trying to push that information forward in our technical assistance and capacity building work, with which Monica, when she was at SGC, she helped start. Just to say that, here's ways that you could use, and they're all, I like to call it, it's all like bureaucratic ninja work, right? Because everything about racial equity, all of the impediments have to somehow go back to some bureaucratic challenge, right? That they're like, oh, we'd love to do it, but we can't because XYZ, the contract manual. So to the extent that we're able to find people who have done things and then normalize that and make it pervasive, that this is something everybody is doing, everyone should be doing. Look, this entity handled it. We end up being able to have leadership be able to take more risks, which I think historically they hadn't in the past. And so anyways, those are, I feel like you're not ever taught those things, but I think that they're really important parts of the conversation. And then there's an important role for the hammer. and the regulation. Like that actually absolutely needs to be in place and needs to be reinforced and needs to be lifted up, you know, and needs to be protected at all costs. But the work that SGC does is really about shaping the carrots.
I love that phrase of bureaucratic ninja work. I'm going to use that. I would just add, I really appreciated those comments, and I would just add to that. You know, I think reporting in public meetings is often what we think of when we think of accountability, right? But I think we really have to go beyond that because, you know, we have a dashboard, we have monthly Sustainability Commission meetings, but if you don't have the right folks receiving that information and acting on it and paying attention to it, and don't have, there are no connections back to government to actually affect change if the results of what's being reported out isn't sufficient, then what is the point? What is the point in that transparency? So again, that's why I think it really is important to get back to the relationship building, the partnership, so that this work can move forward and progress can be made. So in the climate justice plan, there's a whole section on collaborative governance and transparency where we talk about what are the systems changes that are needed to really create accountability in a way that's meaningful and powerful. A very small example, we don't have all the answers, but a small example is that we've passed a local ordinance that adds 4 new seats to the Sustainability Commission. 2 are designated environmental justice seats to be appointed by environmental justice and BIPOC-led organizations, and 2 youth seats to be appointed by youth-led organizations. These are not political appointments; these are community appointments who are will now be on our Sustainability Commission. Again, a small example, but just one of how we're really trying to focus on not just focus on the structural changes for accountability.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for answering these questions. I think we are at time for Q&A and the panel. So just thank you once again for sharing your experiences, your wisdom with all of us. There's a lot of great insights that were in those comments, and I think we'll be able to share your contact information if folks have follow-up. Things to add and so on. So we'll now move into our reflection and stretch break for 5 minutes. So just make sure to move your body a little bit, take a bio break, have things kind of ruminate and whatnot as you think about how to actually actualize racial equity. We'll be discussing that in the breakout rooms in the next section. So I'll pass it to Julia to play some music for us.
Great, thanks, Faye. And again, huge thanks to Leah and Jesse. I know, Leah, you need to hop off, so appreciate you taking the time to join us. Folks, let's take a 5-ish minute stretch break. We'll try to reconvene right around 11:05, and we'll introduce the breakouts. We'll play some music in the background for y'all. Folks, another 10 seconds to rejoin us, and we'll pass it over to Monica to kind of tee us up for our breakout discussions.
All right, can you hear me okay? Okay, great. All right. So thank you, everyone, and thank you so much to Faye and our speakers for getting us started in our first hour. And now we're going to spend some time hearing from all of you, or taking some time to reflect and think about what this looks like in our own work. So big thanks to those of you who have stuck around for hour 2. So before we dive into the individual breakouts, just want to remind folks about the group norms that Julia brought up at the beginning, just to stay engaged, especially as we get into the breakouts, to practice compassionate listening, to be courageous, to take space and make space, and to expect a lack of closure, just bringing those back up as you move into these breakouts. And in the breakout, I'll talk a little bit about what we want y'all to focus on, but we're going to be using a tool called Jamboard, which we used last time in our last meeting. So folks may be familiar already, but just in case we have some new folks, I'll share my screen and we can show you all how to use it. Let me make sure I can find it. This is it. Is this the right thing? Did I pull up the right thing? Oh, okay, here we go. Make sure I have the right. How about that? Is that coming out right?
That's great.
Okay, great. All right. So folks, remember, we've got a board for each breakout room, and you'll see what number breakout room you're in. So just switch to whichever room that you're in. And then really quickly, just to put a sticky note in, you just hit the little sticky note thing on the side, type it in, and then you can move it around into the 3 columns, which I'll go over in just a second. And you can, of course, change the color and all of those fun things. So hopefully that'll be familiar for folks from last time. Go ahead and stop sharing. So for this, what we want y'all to focus on within the Jamboard and then also in the breakout sessions generally center on 3 main topics. So the first thing we want y'all to reflect on is, what is this actualizing racial equity work looking like within your organization? So really asking you all to think about reflecting on Jesse's presentation in particular about what they're doing at Strategic Growth Council internally to make a plan. Are you all doing anything like that in your organization? And if so, we invite you to add some sticky notes or comment on that in your breakout. The second column that you see is about in your adaptation work. So really lifting up Leah's example, how is this playing out in your processes that have to deal with adaptation? What does that actualization look like within your processes related to adaptation and your programs related to adaptation? The third column is really where we ask you to think forward. What are those next steps and opportunities that you see to really do that actualization, if I got that word right, work, bringing it from your organizational development work, planning work into the public and adaptation space? What does that look like moving forward for you all? And again, invite you to add a sticky note and also discuss that amongst ourselves in the session, so we can learn from each other and see kind of where we're at and where we have opportunities to grow. So that's generally what we'll spend our time talking about today. We plan for these to be self-facilitated, so there isn't like an identified facilitator for each of the breakouts. But if you'd like in your group, you're welcome to identify somebody or volunteer someone to be your facilitator. But what we would ask you to do is identify a report out captain, a reporter, so that when we come back, we can hear what you all discuss in your breakout and kind of share the wisdom with the broader group. And what you'll do is, when you get in there, just, spend a few minutes just adding those sticky notes into the various columns, and then, feel free to verbalize and, start the discussion. Myself, Faye, and some of the other folks will be kind of popping in and out of the breakout rooms. We can provide support, listen in and get some of your knowledge, some of your tidbits. And of course, again, you're also able to request assistance, I think, via the Zoom. Julia, our illustrious coordinator, will be in the main room. So if you get popped out for whatever reason or whatever happens, she can help you out. And so we're going to go into these breakouts for about 30 minutes. So around 11:40, we'll invite you all to come back and we'll do just a little report out, kind of identify some themes and what we're hearing. If we have, hopefully, I think Jessie is still with us. Leah will had to head out, but we'll invite Jessie to see if she has any additional wisdom for us and hear from Faye as well. We'll wrap up there. Yeah, Jessie's still here. Great. So that's what we'll be doing for the next 30 minutes. Julia, did I miss anything or anything to add?
No, I think you covered it, and my internet is a little unstable, so it's coming in a little choppy, but we'll go ahead and launch the breakout rooms, and do let us know if you need any support. Enjoy.
Thanks, Julia. Hey, everybody. I know that one, it really surprised me that we got cut off right then. Hopefully everybody's coming back. Our group, we were really deep in discussion. So hopefully everybody was able to get the most out of the time. I know I remember I said that facilities would be hopping around. I didn't hop around at all. I don't know if others did either, but I really enjoyed my breakout and the time we got to spend together. Well, we just have a little bit of time left and we just wanted to get a little bit of a sense of what happened in some of the breakout rooms. If you're like my group, we didn't get a chance to appoint a reporter out person, but we can figure it out anyways. But I'm gonna start backwards actually with calling out breakout rooms. So I think we had, Julia, was it 5 rooms you said? Okay, 5 rooms. So if somebody from room 5 wouldn't mind giving some of the highlights from your conversation, that would be great. And I think you can unmute yourself. So
Okay.
feel free to just chat. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. This is Peggy Nguyen from room 5, and I'm going to do a quick report out of what we talked about. Basically, we started out with, I mean, it wasn't linear like that, but basically at our organizations, some of us had diversity and inclusion strategic plans and things like 90-day challenges to promote racial equity awareness and education in our daily work and life. And kind of moving forward and thinking about where we want to be in terms of next steps. One of our participants talked about wanting to develop stories for a 2040, 2050 vision, similar to what the city of Providence had presented. And someone also mentioned needing to engage the community in climate adaptation, and that that was me. I put in a plug for track 2 workshop on community engagement. We're going to be sharing some tangible ways to do that. And then also in the city of LA, we're working on developing private sector design guidance and incentive system for implementing a healthy LA environmental justice plan. So those are kind of next steps and opportunities. And in terms of work that's currently being done in our own adaptation work to achieve those the strategic goals and the next steps that we want to achieve is we've done needs assessments to figure out who we're not currently reaching with our resources and approaches, and talk to communities about barriers to access and what are ways that we could potentially work together to improve access and improve our collaborative adaptation work. One of the things that I am working on is biodiversity, and so I shared a number of ideas from that, which is basically that we changed our procurement process or our project planning process to include environmental justice and climate adaptation, so that we created this tool where we're training our project managers to think about those things. And in the end, if they incorporate aspects of it into their projects, then we give them extra points and prioritization to fund their projects. We also have been working to develop tools available to the public to kind of give them access to knowledge so that they can be more knowledgeable partners in making decisions, and also have the opportunity to provide their input to improve the tools as well. And so that's just a quick summary of some of the things that we discussed in room 5.
Nice. Okay, thank you, Peggy, and room 5. Moving to room 4. Could we get a representative from room 4 to share some highlights?
Hi, my name is Mavis. I go by she, her pronouns, and I will be representing room 4. So we didn't actually I don't think we inputted as much information on the Jamboard as we did just discussion. And we all came from very different organizations, which was pretty cool. I expressed some barriers with being in a national organization that works with so many different states and entities and partners. And what was really great is that one of the partners that we are trying to better engage with is like tribal nations. There was a representative in our room. And so it was, we sort of discussed how we can utilize both bottom up and top down strategies from a large organization, how if they oh my goodness, you guys got it. If they include
Picking up
it
what you're
more
putting
in
down.
their strategic plans and their grants, then that is actually really helpful for organizations like tribal organizations who can then depend on that and hold us accountable. But then we had a really great discussion about fellowships and job postings and how, just sometimes even changing language, even if it's not a requirement of a job posting, but incorporating like strongly recommends can then help a candidate who may not have the same academic background or as much maybe past job experience be able to still be one of the top candidates and even successfully get the job. So even if there's bureaucratic reasons as to why you might not be able to make something like bilingual be a requirement, you can still incorporate it into your job posting to help candidates like that kind of be moved up higher. And we talked about how, although there may be lots of educational requirements that tend to be a barrier to reaching diverse populations, you can outreach to maybe different like PhD programs that you wouldn't normally reach out to if there is a PhD requirement, but you've primarily been getting students that are, let's say, in the biology or chemistry departments. Start reaching out more to schools with different like liberal arts programs or social sciences to get different candidates that might have more diversity in their field. So we talked about that quite a bit, and I think that was really a large focus of our conversation.
Excellent. Yes, making sure those that are running these processes reflect the communities we're trying to reach. Love the getting around the sort of academic requirements, working for the state. It could just be such a, like, we have these requirements that are trying to be objective and helpful and sometimes aren't in terms of meeting some of these goals. So I definitely appreciate those.
Yeah, and for some reason, like all of our jobs say like you have to be able to lift a 50-pound box, and I mean none of us really have to do that, and that language in itself could really make it so that people who may have physical disabilities don't even look at these postings. But I mean, I've never had to lift a 50-pound box for my job, so I don't know why that's included, for example. So just little things like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Melis and room 4. Maybe we could go to room 3. It looks like Julia's trying to capture some of what you were saying, Melis, into the Jamboard, but maybe we could go to, yeah, perfect. Room 3. Do we have a volunteer?
Yeah, hey Monica, this
Nikki.
is Nikki. I'm from the Office of Planning and Research. We had a great discussion in our group. I'll see if I can cover the highlights. So one, we talked a little bit about how do we value the qualitative data that informs climate vulnerability and climate adaptation. How do we get the lived experiences of community members and community organizations, and how do we actually build the work of supporting that into our internal operations? Like, how do we budget for it to compensate folks? How do we build partnerships? How do we build trust? So a lot of conversation about collaboration and partnership as being like crucial to doing this work. We talked about supporting internal capacity and doing like learning sessions and trainings within and this is partly an example from our own work at the Office of Planning and Research, as we participate in the Capital Collaborative on Racial Equity that Jesse spoke on earlier. Part of that program has helped us take on this concept of results-based accountability and learning how do we exactly ensure that the actions that we're doing actually really result in real change? How do we measure that? How do we identify the real root causes so that we can see the true intervention points that will enable us to take action? That has been so important for me. And that's like such a big, I think, very important key piece of work, is like building that internal understanding of those pieces. Let's see, what else? We talked about issues in, for example, the housing space of like, how do we address the market barriers that kind of get in the way of implementing some of these actions? Like, how do we enable workforce or affordable housing in San Francisco when there's like tons of development pressure and all of these economic forces, gentrification. And so we talked about a couple of different ideas for that. Again, it goes kind of to the root cause analysis, trying to understand like, well, why is it so expensive? Like, what are the incentives? What are the barriers? Who else is involved in this space that might be interested in supporting our solution? So one idea that came out of that was supporting community land trusts as a mechanism to buy land or facilitate affordable housing on land where possible. And I'm sure there's more that we covered, but I think I'll leave it at that unless anyone from my group wants to add something.
Thank you, Nikki, and room 3. So many good nuggets there. I mean, even just quickly on the CLT note, I just was volunteered with a CLT in San Francisco for a couple of years. And it is even in a place like San Francisco where there's a lot of resources and even interest in something like that, just trying to do work like that in a market-based in a real estate market that's market-based is just tremendously challenging, but so much merit and opportunity in those strategies. Really loved what you said about, valuing qualitative data and lived experience. I mean, I think that's something we came up a little bit in our own breakout room, but like, how do we capture lived experience in a setting, particularly in government where everything is so quantitative or widget-based? Where I work, we have a quasi-judicial process. There's not a lot of room for like lived experience and qualitative pieces, but we're really working on trying to figure out how to get those into the work that we do. So really, really appreciated hearing that from y'all. All right, room 2. Do we have somebody from room 2? Thank you, Nikki.
I guess I can, okay, there we go. I can share. So there are a number of different conversations that we had. I think the one that we talked about the most was kind of prioritizing BIPOC folks as staff. So there was an example raised about creating a community college specific internship and really doing a lot of targeted outreach to BIPOC folks there, and then being able to hire them as staff. And there was another question that was raised later about like how we get around the Prop 209 kind of requirements in terms of hiring. So we had a little bit of discussion about ways that you can support BIPOC professionals kind of throughout the internship process or interview process through things like, doing the targeted outreach, looking to BIPOC specific professional networks to do that recruitment, trying to do like blind applicants so that you don't see the names when you're just reviewing the resumes. If you're looking at supporting internship or fellowship programs, maybe giving a little bit more support to the BIPOC fellows who are applying, just thinking about how they may or may not have that kind of internship or like experience kind of doing professional interviews, so that you're trying to level that playing field a little bit at the final interview. Another question that was raised was how to bring in or get buy-in from clients who are more typically your older white men who may or may not be as bought into ideas around racial equity. So we talked a little bit about potentially doing like a pre-orientation or foundational training or conversation with them, thinking also about like how there are examples, real concrete examples of how systemic racism hurts all of us, including white folks. So there's a really great book called The Sum of Us that dives in really deeply into those case studies. So I encourage all of you to look at that one. And that's it.
Yay, thank you so much, room 2 and Faye. We'll quickly go ahead, we're running out of time, so we're gonna go to room 1. And I think our numbers have dwindled, but I'm gonna ask either Daniel or Holly to chime in to maybe give a quick recap of what we talked about in this group.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I guess, Holly, I can go unless you wanna go. I just gleaned so much from this wonderful group. We had Monica Palmiera from the Public Utilities Commission, Bernadette Austin from the Center for Regional Change, Linda Lau, who's a distinguished, experienced professional in resilience in the Bay Area, and Ali Rarely from UC Berkeley. And we are so gifted with what we produce, because we were asking about also like how to effectively gauge, whether we're actually engaging properly with the communities that we aim to serve through the metrics, qualitatively versus quantitatively, and perhaps we have to rein in some economists who know how to, massage those metrics best. But there's so many lessons that we've learned in our collective experience. Linda Lowe, she came with a lot of experience in working with diverse groups, and really reminded us that we have to meet people in their place, and we have to adapt to their environments and their cultures. Cultural competency works in both directions. Folks that have been marginalized in the past should figure out how to get out of the comfort zones and communicate their true concerns to the folks that are the power brokers, and vice versa. And so that was discussed. And what else? Meeting commissioners need to actually meet with their constituents in their places, in public spaces, instead of just being top down. What frustrated me most over this past year, as I was a fire evacuee and had nowhere to go, except Santa Cruz, that's where I live there now, is that the decision makers were making these evacuee decisions based from their Zoom meetings, and they were not on the streets with the people that were actually evacuated from these fires. And so that frustrated the heck out of me, because it was a huge disconnect. So please, even during these crises like COVID, insist on meeting with the people who are in true need. And that should be it, other than to say that, how to actually use these federal dollars that are coming from DC effectively, so that is not lost money. There are expectations, and hopefully the true population that it's meant to serve is actually served, and not just like usurped by private interests and public interests and whatever. So that is sort of an opportunity, and it will be a missed opportunity unless we take advantage of it through good science and good qualitative and quantitative data. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And it was a real pleasure to have you in the breakout as well. All right, well, we have 2 minutes left, so we're going to make the most of our time together. Thank you, everyone, for participating in those report outs. Just want to give both Faye and then Jesse, if Jesse's still on the line, just 1 minute each to reflect if you have anything to add in terms of our conversation, both from our presentations and what you've heard in the report outs in terms of closing thoughts. Maybe we'll see if Jesse's still on the line first, and then Faye second. Jesse, is still there?
Yeah, this is Jessie. I think the thing I've heard the most that I want to take back is that these kinds of forums are the ones that accelerate the pace of progress, because we launch into these problems thinking that we have to solve them by ourselves, but we don't, because we have an incredible amount of knowledge and experience in these networks that we're a part of. And so the network themselves is the strength behind this work. And so I just want to applaud you guys for coming today and showing up and bringing your amazing, brilliant selves to the table. And yes, you can get the presentations.
Thanks. Hey, my co-conspirator.
Yeah, I just kind of want to echo that. I think that the more that we share across peers, the more that we're able to find that the challenges we face are not quite as unique as we think they are. And although, there's some context details, I think that the more that we can, just like work together and push for that cultural shift, we will eventually get there. That's all for me.
Excellent. Well, with that, thank you all so much. I will hand it back to Julia just actually really quick before I hand it back to Julia, just a few more things. So Julia put in the chat, we will share slides, Jamboards, everything that we has been featured today, you will get and receive. Also want to make sure folks are aware of our next session. So it's going to be in a few weeks still. It's going to be Monday, September 27th at 10 a.m. So it's going to be our 3rd workshop in the series. And so Faye and I and the team will be looking at how we're going to structure that based off of today's conversation, as well as everything that's in the easy retro board. If you remember the exercise we did in the first workshop, where we kind of put out priorities, we're going to be using that to plan our next workshop. So that's it from me.
What's
Hi,
up?
yeah.
Just finishing my meeting.
Oh, hey, Daniel, we can hear you. You're on mute. You're not on mute. There we go. And I'll pass it back to Julia. Thank you again, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. I'll keep it super brief since we're already a minute over. Just want to echo what Monica, Faye, and Jesse shared, just thanking everyone for showing up and engaging in these conversations. It's great to see how much work is really getting pushed forward in each of your organizations and for your communities. And this work will only get stronger and better as we all work together. So I don't know if you've noticed a trend, but we are looking to dive deeper and getting closer to implementation. So the third workshop, as Monica noted, we are going to go back to see what input folks shared earlier on in terms of what you're interested in, but we're likely going to continue this path, continue this trend, and dig even deeper into specific implementation strategies on how we can advance equity in our work as adaptation practitioners. So thanks again. We'll share all of the resources from today's workshop later this week or early next week, and we look forward to seeing everyone for our third and final workshop. Thanks, everyone.